How do skeletal muscles know when to contract? Skeletal muscles are voluntary, meaning we consciously control them for the most part. There's a couple exceptions. But what exactly is telling your skeletal muscles to contract? You're probably saying to yourself, the brain. And indeed, that's true. It's the brain and the rest of the nervous system that's communicating a signal to the muscles, telling them to contract. Let's take a look at that pathway. You've probably heard of the cerebrum. It's the largest part of the brain. There's an area in the cerebrum called the motor association area. Motor meaning movement. And in the motor association area, this is where we plan out at the subconscious level, where we plan out our skeletal muscle movements. Eventually, that signal will be sent down the spinal cord, and then the signal has to leave the spinal cord. And the way a signal will get out of the spinal cord is through an organ called a nerve. Nerves are organs. They are one of the main organs of the nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord. And nerves are actually just bundles of nervous system cells called neurons. A neuron has specific parts to it, and there's a really long piece to a neuron called the axon. And it's specifically these axons that we find inside of the nerves. So really, nerves are bundles of axons. And axons act like electrical wiring. They transmit an electrical impulse across them. This impulse, when it reaches the skeletal muscle, this is what is going to cause contraction. At the bottom of the screen here, we can see a close-up of the communication between the nervous system and the skeletal muscle. Number 1 on that image is referring to the axon. Number 2 is specifically the very end of the axon, the termination point of the axon, often referred to as an axon terminal. And number 3 is the muscle fiber. Let's take a closer look at this junction between the nervous system and the skeletal muscle fiber. It turns out we call this the neuromuscular junction. A neuromuscular junction has 3 important parts to it: the neuron part, the muscle part, and the space in between. So the neuron part is just the end of the neuron's axon, usually called the axon terminal, but it has other names too. And then there's a space between the neuron and the muscle fiber, and this is called the synaptic cleft. A synapse is just a meeting place between a neuron and another cell. So a synaptic cleft is just a cleft or a space between the neuron and the other cell. In this case, the other cell is a skeletal muscle fiber. And that's the third piece to a neuromuscular junction. It's a portion of the skeletal muscle fiber called the motor end plate. So the motor end plate is a specific region of the sarcolemma of the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. So the basic function of the neuromuscular junction is that it just allows for the nervous system to communicate with the muscle fiber. In order for this to happen, a nervous system signal has to be sent to that axon terminal of that neuron. And we haven't learned about nervous system signals yet, so we're not going to go into detail here. But we're just going to say that a nervous system signal has to arrive at that axon terminal. When that nervous system signal arrives at the axon terminal, it is going to lead to a chain reaction of events that will cause the axon terminal to release a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is a chemical released by the nervous system for communication purposes. The neurotransmitter that's being released here is called acetylcholine, abbreviated ACH for short. And this is the only neurotransmitter that's ever used by the nervous system to communicate with skeletal muscle. Our nervous system uses a lot of different types of neurotransmitters, but when it comes to skeletal muscle, this is the only one that's used. Once the acetylcholine is released from the axon terminal, it diffuses across that space, that synaptic cleft, and it eventually reaches the motor end plate. Embedded in the motor end plate, we will find receptors. Receptors are proteins that receive stuff. In this case, these receptors are receiving acetylcholine. So these are called acetylcholine receptors. Any kind of receptor that's capable of receiving acetylcholine is termed a cholinergic receptor Cholinergic is just the adjective form of acetylcholine. So anything that can bind to acetylcholine is called cholinergic. So in summary, what's happened so far is the axon terminal released acetylcholine, and now the acetylcholine is binding to receptors in the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. But what happens next? These receptors are chemically gated ion channels. We know that channels are proteins in cell membranes that allow for passive transport. These are chemically gated ion channels. The word before gate tells you what opens the gate on the channel, and the word before channel tells you what goes through it. So what opens the gate? And what's going to go through the channel? If you said acetylcholine opens the gate, you're correct. And if you said ions go through the channel, you're correct again. Let's take a closer look at gated ion channels. So ion channels are proteins in the cell membrane that allow for ions to diffuse into or out of the cell. The ions always follow their concentration gradient. They always go from areas where there's a lot of them to areas where there's less of them. Gated means that sometimes the channel is open and sometimes it's closed. What opens the gate is some sort of stimulus, some sort of event of some kind. Something has to happen to open the gate. The gates are closed all the time unless something opens them. We have chemically gated ion channels that are opened by chemicals. For example, a chemical like a neurotransmitter. We have voltage gated ion channels that are opened by voltages, changes in electricity, changes in charge, if you will. The moving of ions, charged molecules, can cause a change in voltage, which can open these voltage-gated ion channels. We also have mechanically gated ion channels, which, as the name suggests, will open due to movement or mechanics. So vibrations, for example, will open a mechanically gated ion channel. The chemically gated ion channels, don't forget the word before gated tells you what opens it, a chemical. And the word before channel tells you what goes through the channel, in this case, ions. And this is a point of confusion for students because a lot of times they'll tell me that the acetylcholine will open the gate and then the acetylcholine will also go through the channel. But that's not correct. The acetylcholine never actually goes through the channel and never even goes into the muscle fiber cell. And sometimes students will tell me that ions are the chemical that opens the gate and that ions go through the channel, which is also not correct. Ions do go through the channel, but ions don't open the gate. On the bottom of this picture, we see a cell membrane, and we have a little green wedge in the cell membrane to show us the direction of the concentration gradient for those little green pluses. Let's pretend the little green pluses are sodium ions. So we know there's more sodium ions on the top, let's call that outside, and less sodium ions at the bottom, inside. So that means if we open up a channel that will allow sodium ions to go through it, then the sodium ions will go from the area of high concentration, the outside, to the area of low concentration, the inside. Let's take a look at what happens. Here's my sodium ion trying to pass through the phospholipid bilayer, but it can't. The phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane is relatively impermeable to solutes like sodium ions, and that's because the hydrophobic interior of the cell membrane is going to repel things with full charges or partial charges. And sodium is one of those things that has full charge. Now, if we open up a channel that will allow sodium to pass through, then the sodium will move from its area of high concentration, the outside, to the area of low concentration, inside. Now that we know a little bit more about chemically gated ion channels, let's add those in to the function of the neuromuscular junction. So we know that in order for these events to get started, the nervous system signal has to arrive at the axon terminal. When the nervous system signal arrives, it will tell the axon terminal to release the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine will then diffuse across the synaptic cleft and then bind to receptors on the motor end plate of the muscle fiber. Don't forget that these receptors are the chemically gated ion channels. The acetylcholine is the chemical that opens the gate on the ion channel. Once the gate is open, the ions can then follow their diffusion gradient into or out of the cell. In this case, it's sodium that's moving, and sodium enters the muscle fiber through this channel because there's a higher concentration of sodium outside of cells than inside. That's a lot of stuff, right? So basically what we've done is a series of things to get sodium into the muscle fiber. So probably you're asking yourself at this point is, why do we do that? Why do we need sodium in the muscle fiber? That is covered in the next video.